There is something deeply uncomfortable about recognizing that, behind many human behaviors, there exists an unconscious desire for self-destruction. We are not talking about something obvious, like a deliberate decision to end it all. What Freud proposed is much more disturbing, that there is within the psyche a silent, insistent force that pushes us toward suffering, toward the repetition of pain, toward collapse, as if somehow the return to nothingness were more desirable than continuing to exist under the weight of conflict. This force he called the death drive. For a long time, psychology relied on what Freud called the pleasure principle, the idea that human beings seek to avoid displeasure and pursue pleasure as a basic mechanism of survival. It is an elegant theory, almost comforting. After all, it makes sense to imagine that suffering is a mistake in the system, a flaw that must be corrected. But then paradoxes arise. People who sabotage themselves at the threshold of success, relationships that repeat with the same destructive patterns, the relapse that comes exactly when everything seemed to be going well, the pain that returns not as an accident, but as fate. And it is here that Freud proposes what may be one of the most radical ideas of psychoanalysis. What if the mind does not seek only pleasure? What if, on a deeper level, there is a desire to return to the inorganic state, to death, that expresses itself in disguised forms, such as guilt, repetition, failure, sabotage? This theory is not comfortable. It does not offer easy consolation, but it has a brutal power of explanation, because it forces us to look at what is hidden, the cycles that repeat, the patterns that impose themselves, the choices that seem to escape rational control. It is not to say that people want to suffer. No one consciously chooses pain. But there are forces within the psyche that operate on the margins of will, that challenge logic, that act as silent internal scripts, guiding behaviors, affections, and thoughts. Throughout this video, we will dive into this dark territory of the mind. We will understand what Freud really meant by the death drive, how it manifests in everyday life, and why pain so often returns, even when everything in us says we want to avoid it. Not with the intent of pathologizing existence, but of illuminating it. Because what is not understood repeats itself. This is not a video for those seeking quick answers. It is a deep, honest, almost clinical conversation about the nature of human suffering. And perhaps, by the end of it, something within you will stop repeating, because it has finally been heard. Freud believed that all psychic activity obeys a fundamental force, the pleasure principle. This force functions as a primitive yet extremely efficient navigation system that guides the mind to seek what generates immediate satisfaction and to avoid what causes pain. Pleasure here is not just hedonism. It is the discharge of tension, the restoration of balance, the suppression of any excitement that disturbs internal order. For a long time, this explanation was sufficient to account for most human behaviors. The child who cries for food and calms down when breastfeeding, the adult who seeks comfort in vices or distractions, the choices we instinctively make to escape suffering. All of this can be read as manifestations of the pleasure principle operating silently. According to Freud, this tendency arises early in life and continues to govern the functioning of the unconscious even when the ego develops and begins to deal with the demands of reality. Therefore, Freud introduced a second gear into this system, the reality principle. It does not replace the pleasure principle, it modulates it. It teaches the subject to delay gratification, to endure momentary pain in exchange for greater and more lasting satisfaction. We learn to control impulses, to plan, to sacrifice immediate desires for future goals. This makes us functional adults, integrated into the world. But the central gear remains the same, the pursuit of avoiding displeasure, of escaping suffering. The theory seemed solid, but then Freud began to observe something strange in his patients and in himself. behaviors that could not be explained by this dual mechanism. Compulsive repetitions of painful experiences, as if there were a hidden desire to relive the trauma. Distressing dreams that returned even after the traumatic event had been processed. Patients who, in the face of the possibility of healing, sank even deeper into symptoms. It was as if there were a force that did not seek pleasure, nor did it respond to reality. A force that broke with logic. A force that desired to return to ground zero. It was from these observations that Freud dared to challenge his own theory. He recognized that something did not add up in the equation. Human beings, at certain moments, seem to act against their own preservation, against their well-being, against pleasure itself. This required a new hypothesis, one that went beyond pleasure, beyond reason, beyond self-preservation, and thus was born the most unsettling concept of psychoanalysis. A concept that does not settle on the surface, that does not offer comfort, but sheds light on the darkest areas of the mind. A silent, deep force that acts not to save, but to disintegrate. In the next section, we will descend another step into the unconscious and discover what Freud called the death drive, and why it is present, even, and perhaps especially, when everything seems to be going well. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. For years, Freud held firm to the idea that the human mind operated within a field of forces balancing pleasure and reality. But there was something that didn't fit. There was a gap, a crack in the model. An insistent repetition of suffering that served no adaptive purpose, no rational function, and that also did not dissolve over time. He observed patients who seemed to relive traumatic experiences as if they were trapped in an invisible script. There was no pleasure in it, no gain, just repetition, pain, regression, and more pain. It was by analyzing these patterns that Freud proposed an idea that challenged everything he had built up to that point. The existence of a drive that does not seek pleasure, that does not aim for life, but for dissolution. A force that acts silently and autonomously, pushing the psyche toward inertia, toward final discharge, toward a return to the inorganic state. He called this force Todestrieb, the death drive. But what does this mean in practice? It means that not everything we do aims to preserve us, that there is something in us that does not just want to live, but also to annihilate, a desire to cease, to stop, to return to the state prior to life. This impulse manifests indirectly through self-sabotaging behaviors, through addictions that bring no real pleasure, through choices that condemn us to repeat destructive patterns. These are actions that defy the logic of well-being and reveal that there is something deeper than the desire to live, the desire to end. The death drive does not appear as a conscious intention. It infiltrates everyday acts, in the tendency to remain in relationships that hurt, in the impulse to destroy something at the moment it is about to succeed, in the compulsion to repeat what has hurt us the most, as if only by reliving the pain could we finally master it. But control never comes. Only the cycle, the repetition, the fall. It is a drive that works against the ego, against cohesion, against the organization of psychic life. Freud observed this in soldiers returning from war who repeatedly dreamed of scenes of terror. He saw it in children who played at losing beloved objects, reenacting abandonment. And he saw it in patients who seemed to sabotage any possibility of improvement. Why would someone voluntarily relive what traumatized them the most? Because it is not voluntary. It is unconscious. And for that reason, powerful. The idea of the death drive is one of the most rejected in psychoanalysis to this day. It is too uncomfortable. It dismantles any romantic view of humans as organisms seeking to grow, evolve, and fulfill themselves. But perhaps it is precisely for this reason that it carries so much truth. because it looks at what other discourses avoid, because it refuses to ignore the abyss that exists within each person. But this force does not act alone. It finds very specific ways to manifest. And one of the most enigmatic is the phenomenon of repetition. We repeat trauma. We repeat pain. We repeat what we swore we would never allow again. And it is exactly this that we will explore in the next part. Why the mind repeats what hurts the most, and what this repetition reveals about the depths of the unconscious. At first glance, repeating an experience that caused suffering seems like a mistake, a failure in the system, a kind of emotional short circuit. But in the Freudian view, repetition is not a defect. It is a function. The unconscious, unlike the rational mind, does not operate on linear logic. It does not learn over time. It does not evolve with lessons. It repeats. And it repeats because it is trying to say something. It is trying to elaborate, master, reorganize an experience that has not been processed. But the language of the unconscious is not made of words. It is made of acts. Freud called this the compulsion to repeat. A deep mechanism that leads the subject to reenact, time and again, the same conflicts, the same pains, the same failures, as if something within them were trying to solve an unsolvable riddle. We repeat not because we want to suffer, but because the mind, paralyzed in the face of trauma, tries unconsciously to rewrite it. It is an internal theater where the play never ends, where the roles are always the same and the outcome, invariably tragic. It is as if the psyche were saying, "This time, I will understand. This time, I will control. This time, I will not be destroyed." But it cannot, because the trauma that originated the scene is outside of time. It is crystallized, frozen in the unconscious structure, and as long as it is not brought to consciousness, it will continue to demand its repetition, like a ghost that insists on being seen. This pattern can manifest in many ways. People who repeatedly enter abusive relationships, even being aware of it, who choose partners with the same destructive characteristics, as if they were unconsciously reliving childhood dynamics with parental figures, or individuals who abandon projects the moment they start to succeed, as if success triggered an internal alarm of threat. Freud saw this in his patients and named the process repetition as an attempt to tame the untamable. Moreover, he noted that this repetition has something self-punitive about it, as if there were unconscious guilt for wanting too much, for failing, for desiring the forbidden. The death drive, then, intertwines with guilt. The mind punishes itself. Suffering becomes the currency with which a debt that is not understood is paid. And the more one suffers, the more this cycle of silent atonement is reaffirmed. It is a movement that happens in the shadows, and for that reason, so difficult to break. Because it is not enough to want to stop suffering. It is necessary to understand why suffering repeats. What scene is being relived? What initial pain is being updated? And mainly what this repetition is trying to communicate. But the question remains, what makes some people stuck in this cycle while others manage in some way to move on? What differentiates the one who repeats from the one who elaborates? The answer may lie in a factor as dangerous as it is invisible: the addiction to suffering. When pain from being repeated so much ceases to be just pain and becomes identity. And that is what we will talk about in the next part, how the mind clings to pain as if it were a safe harbor, and why letting go of it can be more frightening than continuing to suffer. Over time, pain can cease to be merely a symptom and become a place, an internal space that is known, habitable, almost comfortable. There exists a silent, profound phenomenon, often invisible to the eyes of the person themselves, the addiction to suffering. Not in the vulgar sense of the word addiction as something that is chosen or consciously desired, but as a psychic structure shaped by repetition, where suffering becomes not only familiar, but identity-forming. Freud understood that, in many cases, suffering was not just the result of an internal conflict, but the very foundation of the ego. A fragile base, built on experiences of pain, abandonment, humiliation, or rejection, which silently come to define the image the subject has of themselves. When this image crystallizes, abandoning pain becomes a threat, because for the psyche, abandoning pain would be equivalent to abandoning who one is. This explains why many people, even after years of progress, relapse into old patterns the moment they begin to approach a healthier life. It is not a lack of willpower. It is the fear of the symbolic loss of a self that only knows the world through pain. The mind creates unconscious bonds with suffering. It becomes dependent on it to locate itself in existence, and thus, like a substance addict, the subject returns to what destroys them, not because they want to suffer, but because they do not know who they would be without it. This type of structure is common in people who grew up in chaotic environments where affection was conditioned to pain, where love came with guilt, where recognition only existed through sacrifice. Under these conditions, suffering becomes associated with safety, with presence, with care. The child learns that to be seen, they must suffer. And this lesson inscribes itself in the unconscious with brutal force, guiding adult life without the subject realizing it. Freud once stated that the neurotic suffers from the indecision between pleasure and punishment. And this phrase perfectly summarizes the internal impasse of those trapped in this logic. There is a legitimate desire for happiness, for freedom, for lightness. But there is also a diffuse guilt, a feeling that one does not deserve these things. And in light of this, suffering emerges as a form of self-imposed punishment, a way to restore an internal balance corroded by ghosts of the past. Breaking this cycle requires more than hope. It requires courage, because it involves coming into contact with the original pain. It involves questioning who you are without suffering. What remains when the pain goes away? What is the identity behind the wound? These questions are not simple nor pleasant, but they are necessary. And here we come to a key point. If there is a force that desires pain, that insists on repeating, and that anchors itself in the identity of the ego, is there any chance of liberation? Freud was not a naive optimist, but he believed in one possibility, that of elaboration. And this is what we will address in the next part: how to transform unconscious repetition into consciousness, and why making pain visible may be the first step to weakening its power. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebook, Beyond the Shadow. It breaks down Jung's core ideas and gives you tools to understand yourself more deeply. Link is in the pinned comment. Freud never promised salvation. Psychoanalysis, unlike many modern discourses on mental health, does not offer shortcuts, does not sell cheap optimism, nor does it deliver ready-made formulas. What it offers is something harder, yet infinitely more valuable: lucidity. And lucidity, for Freud, was the first possible step towards any form of liberation. Not liberation in the romantic sense of a life without pain, but in the realistic sense of understanding what binds us, so that, who knows, we might begin to loosen the chains. The death drive cannot be eliminated. It is part of our psychic constitution. It is at the core of who we are, but it can be elaborated. It can be symbolized, transformed, integrated. And it is precisely at this point that analysis enters as a tool for confrontation. Freud believed that by bringing to consciousness what is hidden, the repetitions, the unconscious desires, the silent pacts with pain, the subject begins to gain maneuvering room. Repetition ceases to be destiny and becomes language, something that can be read, interpreted, resignified. This transformation, however, does not happen through willpower or positivity. It requires a deep dive, a return to the formative scenes of pain, a confrontation with guilt, with denied desires, with the psychic truth that consciousness has avoided for so long. It is a process that Freud compared to the work of mourning, recognizing the loss, accepting the pain, elaborating the meaning of what has been lived, and finally, allowing oneself to move forward without denying what happened. When pain is elaborated, it does not disappear, but it changes places. It ceases to operate as an unconscious force that sabotages the subject from within and becomes an integrated, understood, humanized element. What was a symptom becomes a story. What was compulsion becomes choice. What was silent suffering transforms into conscious narrative. Freud saw this happen in his patients. He saw people, previously crushed by repetition, begin to find new ways of existence by naming what was once unspeakable. It is not a miracle. It is work, psychic work, arduous, continuous. But it is possible. And perhaps the hardest point of this process is facing one's own emptiness. Because when suffering is removed from the center of identity, a space emerges, a silence, and now. Pain filled everything. Now, what will the mind do with this open space? It is at this moment that many people return to pain, because emptiness is scarier than known pain. The absence of suffering can seem a greater threat than its presence. But it is also in this emptiness that freedom begins. The chance to build something new, something that is not just a reaction to trauma, but creation. And that is precisely why Freud said, where the id was, the ego must come to be. In other words, where unconscious chaos once reigned, a stronger, clearer, freer consciousness can emerge. But one more step is still needed. Because understanding all this intellectually is not enough. The unconscious does not dissolve with explanations. It needs to be confronted, symbolized, traversed. And that leads us to the last part of this journey. Understanding what it means to make the unconscious conscious, and why this is, perhaps, the only way to take back the reins of one's own existence. Freud, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, writes something unsettling. The goal of all life is death. This is not a metaphor. It is a clinical, theoretical, and radical statement. For him, there is something in the living organism that silently seeks to return to the inorganic state. This force, the death drive, is the axis that sustains the repetitions of suffering, self-destructive behaviors, and the psychic cycles that resist change. And that is precisely why Freud argued that the only way to weaken these unconscious forces is to make their content accessible to consciousness. But this does not happen through positive thinking, nor through attempts to ignore pain. The unconscious does not respond to willpower. It responds to work. Work of symbolization, listening, and elaboration. This process requires looking at pain not as something to be eliminated, but as something that carries meaning, even if that meaning is not yet clear. When you repeat, it is not out of weakness. It is because your mind is enacting something it has not been able to elaborate. Pain becomes a code, and deciphering it is what allows the transformation of compulsion into consciousness. It is at this point that something begins to change, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The subject who begins to recognize their patterns, who understands the emotional roots of their repetition, who confronts their unconscious guilt, starts to gain a different kind of freedom. It is not a perfect freedom, but it is a possible freedom, because it arises from lucidity, and with lucidity comes responsibility. Because when you understand where your pain comes from, you can no longer attribute it solely to chance or to others. You realize that there is an internal script, and that it can be rewritten. not by erasing the past, but by understanding it deeply. If you have made it this far, something inside you has probably already begun to move. So write in the comments, which idea from this video made you stop and think? Sometimes, the simple act of writing is what transforms reflection into consciousness. And don't stop here. The next video is also important on this journey. Each layer you explore reveals more of what acts in silence, and the more you see, the less the unconscious dictates the script.